He waited for his mail-order bride. Instead, conjoined twins claimed his heart. A solitary frontiersman's life is appended when his mail-order bride arrives with an unexpected companion. Elias, a rancher accustomed to isolation, anticipates the arrival of one woman to his remote homestead. Instead, two sisters, Cora and Lily, emerge from the wagon, their bodies inextricably linked. Their shared condition, a product of a life spent as a sideshow curiosity, immediately creates a host of practical and emotional challenges. Elias quickly realizes that his simple desire for companionship has entangled him in a complex web of secrets and danger. The sisters, having escaped a life of exploitation, are not just seeking a quiet new beginning, they are on the run. The arrival of three men on horseback confirms Elias's growing suspicion that Cora and Lily are being pursued. The leader of the group, a man named Sterling, offers Elias a substantial sum to hand the women over, claiming they are his company's property. This forces Elias to confront a moral dilemma that challenges his long-held preference for solitude and self-preservation. Against a backdrop of legal threats and the promise of a lucrative payoff, Elias makes a stand. He rejects Sterling's offer, choosing to protect the sisters from their past. The ensuing confrontation, a brutal and decisive gunfight, pits Elias's intimate knowledge of the land against the bounty hunter's professional experience. His willingness to fight for something more than his own survival transforms his defense into a courageous act of love and commitment. Months later, the homestead, once a bastion of loneliness, has become a home. Elias and the sisters forge a new life together, their unconventional family unit thriving in the unforgiving wilderness. The sisters' unique skills and unwavering spirit transform the ranch into a prosperous and peaceful sanctuary. This new life is a testament to the unexpected bonds that can form when courage, compassion, and a shared desire for freedom collide. Their story becomes a powerful example of how love can blossom in the most unusual of circumstances, creating a haven where three damaged souls can finally find purpose and belonging. The wagon stopped at exactly the wrong place. Elias Barrett had been counting the days, marking each sunrise with a scratch on his fence post, waiting for one bride to arrive at his isolated ranch. But when the dust settled, two women stepped down from the wagon, connected at the neck by flesh and bone in a way that made his breath catch in his throat. The mail-order bride service had sent him exactly what he'd paid for, and somehow everything he'd never imagined. Clara spoke first, while Violet remained silent, their heads turning in perfect coordination as they surveyed the barren landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The wagon driver wouldn't even look at them directly, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon as he unloaded a single trunk from the back. Elias had prepared for awkward conversation with a shy woman, maybe some difficulty adjusting to frontier life, but he'd never prepared for this. The driver dropped the money pouch on the ground, climbed back onto his wagon, and disappeared down the dusty trail without a word, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the desert heat. Clara and Violet stood perfectly still, their unusual condition making every movement a carefully coordinated dance, and Elias realized that whatever he'd been expecting from this arrangement, he was about to discover something far more complicated. The strangest part wasn't how they looked or moved together. The strangest part was how they'd somehow made it this far into the wilderness when most people couldn't survive a week alone out here. Something about their presence didn't match their apparent vulnerability, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something about this place, about him, that they hadn't mentioned in their letters. Elias Barrett had lived alone for so long that conversation felt like a foreign language, but silence with these two women felt even stranger. Clara and Violet Monroe stood in his doorway, their shared connection making them move like a single organism with two distinct personalities. Clara's eyes swept across the modest cabin interior, while Violet studied Elias himself, and he realized that every decision in his life had led to this impossible moment. The trunk at their feet contained everything they owned, which couldn't be much considering its size. 3 months of letters had prepared him for a shy woman seeking escape from city life, not this complex arrangement that challenged everything he understood about companionship. Clara stepped forward first, forcing Violet to match her movement, and their coordination was so seamless that Elias wondered how long they'd been perfecting this careful dance. The cabin suddenly felt smaller with 3 people inside, especially when 2 of them required extra space to navigate doorways and furniture. Elias had spent weeks preparing a simple room with a single bed, and now he faced the practical reality that nothing in his isolated world was designed for their unique situation. Clara spoke with confidence, while Violet observed silently, creating an unbalanced conversation that left Elias unsure where to direct his attention. They'd traveled over 200 miles to reach his ranch through territory that claimed experienced travelers, yet they'd arrived without visible injury or exhaustion. The mail order service had charged him standard rates for 1 bride, but they'd somehow managed to arrange passage for 2 people with extraordinary travel requirements. Elias poured water from his pitcher into the wash basin, his hand shaking slightly as he realized he'd been living in complete solitude for over 6 years, and now 3 people needed to share space designed for 1. Clara mentioned their previous living arrangements in careful, vague terms, while Violet's eyes revealed depths of experience that didn't match their apparent youth. The afternoon light streaming through his single window illuminated dust motes that danced between them, and Elias understood that his carefully ordered existence was about to become something entirely unpredictable. Their letters had mentioned a desire for a fresh start and quiet life, but they hadn't explained how 2 people connected at the neck had managed to convince a mail order service to arrange a frontier marriage. As evening approached, Elias faced the immediate challenge of sleeping arrangements, meals for 3 instead of 1, and the growing suspicion that Clara and Violet had chosen his remote location for reasons they hadn't shared in their correspondence. The first meal together revealed more problems than Elias had anticipated, starting with the simple fact that Clara and Violet couldn't sit in regular chairs. They stood beside the table while he ate, their careful coordination making every movement deliberate and practiced, and Elias realized that basic activities he'd taken for granted would require complete reorganization. Clara ate quickly and efficiently while Violet picked at her food, their different appetites creating an awkward rhythm that left Elias uncertain when the meal was actually finished. The conversation during dinner was even more challenging, with Clara asking direct questions about the ranch operations, while Violet remained completely silent, her eyes tracking every detail of the cabin's interior. Elias had expected some adjustment period with a mail-order bride, but he'd never considered how to accommodate 2 distinct personalities sharing the same physical space. Clara mentioned their previous work in a boarding house, carefully avoiding details about why they'd left, while Violet's expression suggested there were painful memories attached to their past employment. The nearest neighbor lived 30 miles away, which had been perfect for Elias's solitary existence, but now he wondered if their isolation might create problems he hadn't considered. As darkness fell, the reality of sleeping arrangements became unavoidable, and Elias found himself offering his own bed while he took the floor, an arrangement that felt both necessary and completely inadequate. Clara accepted his offer with practical gratitude, while Violet finally spoke for the first time, asking quietly about the security of the doors and windows. Her question carried an undertone of fear that made Elias wonder what kind of threats they'd faced in their previous life, and why they'd chosen to travel hundreds of miles into dangerous territory to marry a complete stranger. The ranch was defensible but remote, with no law enforcement within a 3-day ride, which had always suited Elias's preference for independence, but now seemed potentially problematic. Clara and Violet prepared for sleep with the efficiency of people who'd learned to coordinate intimate activities out of necessity, and their quiet cooperation made Elias feel like an intruder in his own home. They'd brought minimal possessions, but maximum complications, and Elias lay on the hard floor, listening to their whispered conversation in the darkness. The letters had mentioned their desire for security and stability, but their actual presence raised questions about what they were running from and whether his isolated ranch represented safety or just another kind of trap. Sleep eluded Elias as he stared at the ceiling, wondering how three damaged people were supposed to build something resembling a family when none of them had experience with normal relationships. Morning brought practical challenges that Elias hadn't considered during his months of lonely anticipation. Clara and Violet needed help with basic tasks that required bending or reaching, their connected necks making simple activities like washing clothes or gathering eggs nearly impossible without assistance. Elias found himself constantly repositioning himself to help them navigate doorways, furniture, and the uneven terrain around the ranch buildings. Clara approached these limitations with matter-of-fact acceptance, while Violet showed visible frustration, and their different attitudes toward their shared condition created an underlying tension that filled the cabin. The ranch work that had occupied Elias's solitary days now required constant interruption to accommodate their needs, and he began to understand why they'd been willing to travel so far for a marriage to a stranger. Clara revealed skills in cooking and mending that far exceeded what she'd mentioned in her letters, while Violet demonstrated an unexpected knowledge of animal behavior that suggested experience beyond boarding house work. Their previous employment story was developing holes that Elias couldn't ignore, especially when Violet instinctively identified the signs of a sick calf that Elias himself had missed. The isolation that had protected Elias's emotional wounds now felt like a potential trap, with three people who barely knew each other forced into intimate daily contact with no escape or privacy. Clara's confidence seemed designed to mask Violet's more obvious vulnerability, and Elias wondered if their decision to marry a frontier stranger was desperation disguised as adventure. The morning routine of feeding livestock became a complex choreography, with Clara and Violet working together to accomplish tasks that would have been simple for one person, their coordination speaking 2 years of forced cooperation. Elias caught himself watching them with fascination and of them practical concern, and he realized that his loneliness had created a hunger for a human connection that was stronger than his discomfort with their unusual situation. By midday, Violet had spoken more words to his animals than to him, her gentle voice calming the horses in a way that suggested natural talent rather than casual experience. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away, which meant that whatever arrangement they worked out would need to sustain them through the coming winter months with no outside intervention or support. Clara mentioned their need to send word back to the mail order service, confirming their safe arrival, but she avoided any details about family or friends who might be concerned about their welfare. The afternoon heat drove them inside, where the close quarters made every conversation feel charged with unspoken questions about how 3 virtual strangers were supposed to build a life together. Elias had imagined marriage as a gradual process of getting to know one person, but instead, he faced the complex challenge of understanding 2 very different women whose lives were permanently intertwined in ways that defied his understanding. The 3rd day brought unexpected visitors that changed everything Elias thought he understood about his new situation. 3 men on horseback appeared at the ridge overlooking his ranch, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation, and they remained there for nearly an hour before disappearing back toward the main trail. Clara and Violet's reaction to the distant riders was immediate and unmistakable fear, with Violet grabbing Clara's arm and both women retreating into the cabin without explanation. Elias had lived in this isolated location for 6 years without uninvited visitors, and the timing of these strangers felt too coincidental to ignore. Clara's hands shook as she peered through the cabin's single window, while Violet whispered urgent questions that Elias couldn't quite hear from across the room. The women's terror was so genuine and immediate that Elias found himself checking his rifle and scanning the horizon for signs of additional threats he didn't understand. Clara finally explained that they'd had trouble with men before, but her vague description didn't match the intensity of their current fear or the specific nature of their precautions. Violet mentioned something about people who wouldn't understand their condition, but her words carried undertones that suggested more complex dangers than simple prejudice or curiosity. The riders had maintained their distance and shown no obvious hostile intent, yet Clara and Violet's response indicated they recognized something specific about these particular men. Elias realized that his isolated ranch might not be the safe haven he'd promised in his letters, especially if his new wives had brought unknown dangers with them from their previous life. The afternoon passed with Clara and Violet taking turns at the window, their coordinated vigilance speaking to experience with this kind of threat that went far beyond normal caution. Elias had chosen frontier life specifically to avoid complicated human relationships, but now he found himself responsible for protecting two women whose past clearly included enemies he couldn't identify or understand. Evening brought no return of the mysterious riders, but Clara and Violet's tension remained high, their whispered conversations stopping abruptly whenever Elias approached. The practical challenges of their physical connection had been manageable, but the emotional secrets they carried were proving far more difficult to navigate. Elias had paid for a mail-order bride, seeking a simple, fresh start, but he was beginning to suspect that Clara and Violet's journey to his ranch was more escape than adventure. The isolation that had always protected Elias's solitude now felt like vulnerability, with three people trapped together in a remote location while unknown threats circled in the distance. As darkness fell, Elias found himself wondering if the marriage arrangement he'd thought would solve his loneliness had instead invited dangerous complications into his carefully ordered world. The fourth morning brought Clara's confession, delivered in whispered urgency, while Violet pretended to sleep beside her. They weren't actually married to each other as Elias had assumed, but sisters whose unusual condition had made them valuable to a traveling show that displayed human curiosities for paying audiences. Clara explained how they'd been contracted performers for 3 years, earning money, losing dignity with every performance until they'd saved enough to escape during a stop in Kansas City. The mail-order bride arrangement had been Clara's desperate plan to disappear completely, using their combined savings to purchase passage to the most remote location they could find. Violet's silence wasn't shyness but shame, according to Clara, because she'd been the one who originally agreed to the show contract when they'd been starving and homeless after their parents died. Elias listened to this revelation while maintaining his morning routine, feeding livestock and checking fences, but every detail Clara shared changed his understanding of why two young women would risk frontier marriage to a complete stranger. The traveling show had been planning to sell their contract to a larger operation that would have taken them to cities throughout the East, where they would have become permanent prisoners to other people's curiosity and cruelty. Clara's voice carried a combination of relief and terror as she explained how they'd stolen away in the middle of the night, using forged papers to book passage west before anyone discovered their disappearance. The three men who'd watched the ranch yesterday weren't random travelers, but bounty hunters hired by the show to retrieve valuable property, and their patient observation suggested they were planning a careful approach rather than immediate confrontation. Elias realized that his simple desire for companionship had entangled him in a conflict between human dignity and commercial exploitation that was far more complex than he'd ever imagined. Clara begged him to understand that they'd never intended to bring danger to his home, but their options had been limited to frontier marriage or eventual imprisonment in increasingly degrading circumstances. Violet finally spoke, her voice barely audible, confirming that the bounty hunters would probably offer Elias money to surrender them peacefully, since they preferred to avoid violence that might damage their valuable merchandise. The legal complications were staggering, since the traveling show had legitimate contracts and territorial law enforcement would likely support property rights over personal freedom. Elias found himself facing a choice between his own safety and the protection of two women whose desperate circumstances had led them to his isolated ranch. The practical reality was that 3 armed men could easily overpower his defenses, especially since he'd never intended to fight for anything more complicated than his livestock and crops. By afternoon, the 3 riders returned with a white flag and a business proposition that made Elias's blood run cold. The lead man, a well-dressed individual who introduced himself as Theodore Kane, explained that he represented the Continental Curiosity Company and was authorized to offer $500 for the peaceful return of their contracted performers. Kane spoke with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to negotiations involving human property, and his casual use of legal terminology made it clear that he'd handled similar recoveries many times before. Clara and Violet remained hidden inside the cabin while Elias listened to Kane's proposal, which included compensation for his trouble and assurance that no charges would be filed against him for harboring escaped performers. The bounty hunter explained that territorial courts consistently upheld performance contracts as legitimate business arrangements, especially when the performers had accepted advance payments and then failed to fulfill their obligations. Kane's 2 companions remained mounted and silent, their hands resting casually near their weapons in a gesture that managed to be both relaxed and threatening. Elias found himself studying these men while they spoke, noting their expensive equipment and professional demeanor, and realizing that Clara and Violet had been running from organized business interests rather than random criminals. The legal reality was even worse than Clara had explained, since the Continental Curiosity Company had legitimate paperwork supporting their claim to the sister services for an additional 2 years. Kane mentioned that similar cases had been resolved quietly throughout the territory, with local law enforcement supporting business contracts over individual preferences, especially when the individuals in question were considered valuable property. The $500 offer represented more money than Elias could earn from his ranch at 3 good years, and Kane's patient explanation of the legal consequences of refusing made it clear that cooperation was expected rather than requested. Elias asked for time to consider the proposal, and Kane agreed to return the following morning for his answer, but his parting words made it clear that delay was a courtesy rather than an actual choice. The afternoon passed with Clara and Violet alternating between desperate hope and resigned acceptance, their whispered conversations revealing years of calculated survival in circumstances that had offered no good options. Elias found himself torn between practical self-preservation and protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed, especially as he watched Violet's quiet courage and Clara's determined optimism, despite their hopeless situation. The reality was that his isolated ranch offered no real sanctuary from organized pursuit, and his limited resources couldn't sustain a prolonged conflict with professional bounty hunters backed by legitimate business interests. Evening brought the crushing weight of an impossible decision, with Elias understanding that tomorrow would determine whether 3 lonely people could build something worth defending or whether practical reality would separate them forever. Dawn arrived with Elias's decision already made, forged through a sleepless night of weighing conscience against survival. He'd spent 6 years building walls against human connection, but watching Clara and Violet's quiet courage had broken something fundamental inside his carefully constructed isolation. Theodore Kane and his men appeared precisely at sunrise, their punctuality speaking to a professional efficiency that made Elias's amateur defenses seem pathetic by comparison. Clara and Violet stood behind him. He faced the bounty hunters, their coordinated movement lending him a strength he hadn't known he needed. Kane's smile carried the confidence of a man who'd never encountered serious resistance to his business propositions, especially from isolated ranchers with more conscience than sense. Elias delivered his answer with a steady voice and shaking hands, rejecting the $500 and demanding that Kane leave his property immediately. The bounty hunter's expression shifted from surprise to calculated anger, his business courtesy evaporating as he realized that negotiation had failed and force would be necessary. Kane's 2 companions dismounted and spread out to flank the cabin, their movements coordinated and deliberate, while Cain himself remained mounted to maintain a positional advantage. Elias had anticipated this response and positioned himself near the corral fence, where his knowledge of the terrain offset their superior numbers and experience. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive, with Elias using the landscape he'd worked for 6 years to compensate for his limitations as a gunfighter. Cain's overconfidence led him to underestimate both Elias's determination and his familiarity with every rock, ditch, and sight line around the ranch buildings. The first exchange of gunfire scattered Cain's men and wounded one of them seriously enough to end his participation in the conflict. Cain himself proved more resilient and dangerous than his companions, but his urban fighting experience was poorly suited to frontier terrain and defensive tactics. Elias's years of hunting and protecting livestock had given him skills that translated surprisingly well to human conflict, especially when he was fighting for something more valuable than his own survival. The decisive moment came when Cain attempted to circle behind the cabin, exposing himself to the crossfire that Elias had been maneuvering to create throughout the engagement. Clara and Violet had remained inside during the shooting, but their presence gave Elias a focus and determination that transformed his desperate defense into effective resistance. Cain's final mistake was assuming that a frontier marriage represented a casual commitment rather than the desperate bond between 3 people who'd found something worth defending. The silence that followed the gunfire felt heavier than the violence itself, with 3 bodies scattered around the ranch yard and the smell of gunpowder mixing with the morning air. 3 months later, the Barrick Ranch had been transformed into something none of them had imagined possible. When Clara and Violet first stepped down from that dusty wagon, Elias had buried Cain and his men in unmarked graves beyond the ridge, and the Continental Curiosity Company had apparently decided that pursuing escaped performers wasn't worth the cost of additional bounty hunters. Clara's practical skills had turned the modest cabin into a genuinely comfortable home, while Violet's natural ability with animals had improved the ranch's productivity beyond anything Elias had achieved alone. The sleeping arrangements had evolved into a practical solution that respected everyone's privacy while acknowledging the reality of their unusual family structure. Elias had built an addition to the cabin with separate sleeping quarters, connected by a wide doorway that accommodated Clara and Violet's needs, while providing them with their own space. The nearest neighbors had eventually visited and accepted the Barrett family's unconventional arrangements with the pragmatic tolerance that frontier life demanded from people who understood that survival required cooperation rather than judgment. Clara had taken charge of correspondence with distant suppliers and maintained careful records of ranch operations, while Violet had developed a reputation among local ranchers for her ability to diagnose and treat sick livestock. Elias had discovered that his capacity for love was larger than his fear of vulnerability, and that protecting Clara and Violet had given his life a purpose that extended far beyond mere survival. The legal complications surrounding their escape from the traveling show had been resolved through careful documentation of the contract's exploitative terms and testimony from other escaped performers who'd found refuge in distant territories. Clara and Violet's marriage to Elias had been formalized through a traveling preacher who'd asked no uncomfortable questions about their unusual situation, focusing instead on their obvious commitment to building a life together. The ranch now supported 3 people comfortably, with plans for expansion that would provide security for their unconventional family through future winters and potential challenges. Elias had learned to coordinate his daily activities with Clara and Violet's needs, while they'd adapted to frontier life with an enthusiasm that suggested genuine happiness rather than mere gratitude for escape. The isolation that had once protected Elias's wounds now sheltered a family that had been rejected by conventional society, but had found acceptance and purpose in each other's company. Evening meals had become collaborative efforts where Clara's cooking, Violet's quiet conversation, and Elias's accounts of daily ranch activities created a routine that felt both comfortable and permanent. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together had evolved into something far more complex and satisfying than any of them had expected when they'd first committed to this desperate gamble. As winter approached, the Barrett Ranch stood as proof that three damaged people could create something stronger together than any of them had managed alone, and that love could grow in forms that defied conventional understanding but served human needs perfectly. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.